It's late summer, 1854, in London's Soho district. People are suddenly falling violently ill, and within days, entire neighborhoods are being wiped out by a fast-moving cholera outbreak. If you look closely at how people lived then, the devastation makes sense. Families were crammed into tiny, unventilated rooms. Waste flowed openly in the streets. The massive population density created a perfect environment for a lethal disease to spread. The top medical experts of the era rushed in to help. They set up clinics, applied the best medical treatments available, and worked around the clock to contain the damage. But the death toll kept climbing. Their failure to stop the outbreak came down to a simple error. They were applying the absolute maximum amount of effort to a problem based on a totally incorrect assumption. The established medical consensus at the time was miasma theory. The belief was that diseases like cholera were airborne, carried through the city by foul-smelling vapors. Because every doctor assumed the air was the culprit, they spent their time examining patients' breathing and observing individual symptoms. They never thought to look down at the ground. In psychology, there is a cognitive bias known as the law of the hammer. It states that if the only tool you carry is a hammer, you will eventually treat every problem you encounter as a nail. The doctors in Soho were trapped by their own expertise. To stop the dying, they didn't need to prescribe more medicine or work longer hours. They needed to put down the medical hammer and pick up a completely different tool. A local physician named John Snow decided to abandon the standard medical playbook. He stopped examining individual patients and stepped back to look at the entire neighborhood. This is a 19th century map of London. Instead of acting as a doctor, Snow began acting as a geographer. He used this map to perform an early version of spatial analysis. He walked the streets, interviewed grieving families about their daily habits, and began placing a black mark on the map for every recorded fatality. Once the data was visualized geographically, a clear pattern emerged. The black marks weren't scattered randomly by the wind. They were tightly clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street. Snow solved a crisis that baffled the medical establishment by stepping outside of it. By applying a geographical framework to a biological problem, he completely bypassed the blind spots of his own profession. What John Snow used is called a mental model. A mental model is simply a conceptual framework you keep in your head to interpret how the world works. We all use them constantly without realizing it. If you want to understand why housing prices go up, you pull out the model of supply and demand from economics. If you're trying to figure out why a teenager's bedroom always degrades into a mess, you can borrow the concept of entropy from physics. Or if you need to predict how two rival businesses will price their products, you turn to game theory from sociology. The danger is that as you gain experience in your career, you rely heavily on the same frameworks that work well for daily tasks. In psychology, these ingrained shortcuts are called heuristics, and they naturally limit your perspective. If you want to avoid the trap that caught the doctors in Soho, you have to actively collect analytical tools from disciplines completely unrelated to your own. Now, it is true that no single framework can perfectly map onto reality. The real world is infinitely complex, and abstract concepts always lose some detail in translation. As the statistician George Box noted, all models are wrong, but some are useful. You don't learn mental models to find an absolute, universal truth. You learn them to strip away the overwhelming noise of a situation, so your brain can actually process the core mechanics at play. A good model simplifies the chaos. It highlights the variables that actually matter, allowing you to make a confident, effective decision. The prospect of learning multiple disciplines might sound exhausting, but you don't need a doctorate in physics or economics to benefit from their insights. You can rely on the Pareto distribution, a statistical rule showing that 80% of results come from 20% of causes. Applied to learning, mastering the basic fundamentals of a few subjects provides the foundation to analyze almost any situation. When you look through multiple lenses, you start spotting critical details that specialists walk right past. As author Arthur Conan Doyle once wrote, "The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes." Think about a stubborn obstacle you've been facing at work or in your personal life. What happens if you stop attacking it with your usual methods and try analyzing it like an engineer or a biologist or a historian? Overcoming complex challenges doesn't require grinding harder against a brick wall. It usually just requires reaching into a broader toolbox and finding a better way to think.